The soldier froze the moment he stepped onto the front porch. The old woman was bent over, pointing at a bowl of cold rice, scolding a little girl curled up in the corner of the garage. But when the child turned her face and whispered, "Papa," the soldier felt as if he had walked straight into a nightmare. How could a grandmother lock her own granddaughter in a place like that? Do you believe that sometimes pain begins with the people closest to us? Ellie sobbed in sharp, broken bursts, like something inside her was being squeezed tight. The sound would rise, then choke off in her tiny throat. Every sob made her shoulders tremble, as if even breathing too deeply might shatter her small, fragile body. Children don't have words to fight back. They cling to sobs and pleading eyes, hoping to hold on to whatever warmth is left in the hearts of grown-ups. And sometimes it's that very sound, the choking grief, that silences all the excuses adults use to defend their inaction. "If you won't eat, then sit there until morning." The voice sliced through the air like a dull blade. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Just low enough sharp at every word, and it was enough to freeze a child like Ellie in place. Michael stood outside, not yet stepping into the yard. His hand still clutched the strap of his duffel bag caked with the dust of Dry Creek Base. Only someone who had grown up under that voice, that kind of command, could understand the chill that settled along every vertebrae. He had thought about this moment so many times during those quiet nights on base. Had anyone tucked Ellie in? Did she still remember the lullaby Sarah used to sing when she was afraid of the dark? And now the first thing to greet him wasn't arms around his neck or a smile at the door. It was a sigh, a bowl of cold rice, and an aging woman squatting in front of the garage. Margaret, his mother, didn't show any reaction when she saw her son. She glanced at him, then turned away as if his presence was unexpected, maybe even unwelcome. Look at her. She's sitting there just because she wouldn't eat a bowl of cold rice. Kids these days are so weak. All they do is cry. Ellie sat huddled in the shadows, her knees drawn tightly to her chest, bare feet stained with dirt. Her shirt was twisted hair matted to her cheeks. That face, just 4 years ago, used to rest on Michael's shoulder every night. Now it was blank with fear, hollow, trying hard not to look anyone in the eye. Michael didn't speak. He slid the bag off his shoulder and placed it on the ground. Then he quietly stepped toward the garage door. No one stopped him. No one asked where he had been. Only his heavy breathing and a silence sharp as ice remained between them. His hand closed around the doorknob. He held his breath. The wooden door creaked open. Light from the hallway spilled onto the stained concrete floor coated in dust and the scent of mold and neglect. Ellie shrank further into the corner arms, shielding her face like even the light might hurt her. When she looked up, her eyes widened, disbelieving the figure standing in the doorway. Her lips quivered, her eyes filled with tears. Papa! That sound. It was as fragile as a dream Michael had imagined hundreds of times, but in his dreams she would run to him arms wide, giggling. Now Ellie could only crawl a few inches before collapsing. Her legs had no strength, her hands trembled. He picked her up in his arms. Ellie was so thin that Michael could feel her shoulder blades through the thin fabric of her shirt. Her head rested gently against his chest. He didn't ask anything. He just held her tighter. Her tears soaked into his shirt little by little. I didn't want to eat the cold rice. It was hard, cold. The broken sentence felt like something inside him dropped silent, but leaving behind a hollow that couldn't be filled. Michael turned, gently set Ellie down on the living room bench, and then faced his mother. I didn't serve in the military just to come back to this. I came home hoping to see my daughter well-fed, loved, not locked in the garage with a bowl of cold leftovers. And she's only 4 years old, Mom. Margaret crossed her arms. Don't tell me how to raise a child. Back in my day, you kids ate what was left over, slept on the floor, and still grew up just fine. These days, say one harsh word, and they start bawling. Michael stepped closer. His eyes darkened, but his voice stayed low, steady, like the weight of stones. I didn't come back to argue with you, but I also won't stay silent when my daughter's being treated like this. She's not a target for anyone's anger. She's my child, your granddaughter. The space between them felt suffocating, as if even a single sigh could make it all fall apart. But Michael didn't back down. He knelt and carefully wrapped a light scarf around Ellie's shoulders. Margaret still stood there, unmoving. She only pressed her lips together. You're spoiling her. Just like your wife did. She left you dump the kid on me and disappeared. I'm the one who raised that child from the day she was in diapers, and now you come back and point fingers at me. Michael didn't respond right away. He looked down at Ellie, who had curled back into his chest, her tiny hands clinging tightly to his shirt, as if afraid she'd be pulled away again. Some adults spend their whole lives justifying why they hurt children, but now that I'm a father, I understand this: no anger is ever worth more than my child's smile, and I won't let that smile disappear again. He lifted Ellie again. As he walked past his mother, he didn't look back. He only said one thing: this is no longer a safe home, and if you won't change, then you're the one who needs to leave. In Ellie's eyes, her father had never looked more real. It wasn't the worn military uniform nor the stern look in his eyes. It was the way his arms held her so gently, as if no war had ever touched them. In that quiet room, only the steady rhythm of their breathing remained. Some homecomings aren't marked by luggage or hugs, but by the resolve in someone's eyes, by the way a person stands up for the one they love. Sometimes for a child to believe they are truly loved, all it takes is one adult who doesn't look away when they're shaking in fear. Before we go on, if you believe no child should have to grow up in silence and pain leave a heart below, and if you've ever witnessed something unjust like what Michael faced, feel free to share. Because maybe your story might be the light someone else needs in their darkest hour. Michael remained silent as Margaret stepped out of the kitchen. Her face showed no trace of surprise, as if her son returning unexpectedly from the military meant absolutely nothing. Her eyes skimmed over him and stopped on the little girl standing behind his leg. She reached out and tapped her finger lightly against the wooden table, following a rhythm that seemed too familiar, then spoke as if picking up a conversation that had been paused a long time ago. So you're back. I figured you were still off doing something big over at Dry Creek. You think walking through that door means everything's just going to go back to the way it was? Michael didn't respond, but the way he gently brushed his daughter's hair said everything. Ellie clung to him like he was the only solid ground in a strange sea. Her small hand trembled as it gripped the fabric of his shirt so tightly it wrinkled beneath her fingers. The child didn't cry, but the look in her eyes was guarded, as if every move she made needed to be calculated, even just shifting her gaze away from the cold bowl of leftovers sitting by the garage door, as if doing so might trigger a punishment at any moment. Margaret picked up a glass of water from the table, took a sip, and set it down again. The dry thud echoed sharply in the quiet. She glanced from her son to her granddaughter, then smirked. She's not crying because she got hit. She's crying because she's stubborn. Someone needs to teach her how to be afraid. You think kids grow up decent just by cuddling them and cooing over them? Ellie flinched and pulled herself tighter against her father. Michael sat down and gently touched her cheek, speaking in a voice soft as breath. Are you cold, sweetheart? The little girl nodded her eyes, never leaving the bowl. Have you been in there a long time? She nodded again this time, adding a whisper so faint it sounded like even she wasn't sure she was allowed to speak. It was really dark. I kept singing, but nobody opened the door. Michael was still for a moment, then slowly turned toward his mother. But Margaret didn't look up. Her eyes stayed fixed on the cleaning rag in her hand as she rubbed the table in slow, repetitive strokes, like whatever dirt was left on the wood mattered more than the words that had just come out of a child's mouth. In the little world she had built around herself, dust needed to be cleaned. Pain was just background noise. She's just like her mother, nothing but songs and daydreams. I get a headache just hearing her voice. You know, her mom used to sing all through those summer afternoons, right? Instead of doing the laundry, she'd just hum some nonsense. And in the end, what did she leave you with? A kid and a whole pile of responsibility. Michael didn't say anything. He simply bent down and picked Ellie up, his movements slow and gentle, as if he were afraid of breaking something fragile. The little girl wrapped her arms around his neck and rested her head on his shoulder, as if that was the only place in the world where she felt safe. There wasn't a single sob, but each rapid, uneven breath told Michael that her fear hadn't faded yet. He paused, his eyes falling on the bowl set on the pale gray tile floor. The leftover rice had dried out, forming a thin crust on the surface. Next to it lay a pair of broken plastic chopsticks, bent at the ends, as if they had been slammed down multiple times. He didn't kneel down or touch anything, but his hand clenched slightly inside his jacket pocket. His eyes lingered for just a moment, long enough to remember, before he quietly moved on each step, heavier than the packs he used to carry through years of deployment. The old bedroom was still there, the door frame sagging on rusted hinges, the walls stained by time. Michael set his daughter down on a chair near the window and opened the closet. A musty scent of damp wood rose up, bringing with it a tangle of unnamed memories. In the bottom drawer, he found a stack of children's drawings, edges yellowed paper crumpled. He flipped through each page. One drawing made him freeze. A dark rectangle drawn thick in black enclosed a little girl sitting with her knees pulled to her chest. Her eyes were wide tears penciled in so heavily they had smudged the paper. In the bottom corner, in unsteady handwriting, were the words, "No hey soul, no sunlight." And right beside that, tiny music notes floated downward as if falling from the child's mouth. Michael went still. He sat beside Ellie and held the drawing up for her to see. "Did you draw this?" Ellie didn't speak. She just stared at the picture, her eyes distant, unmoored, like a child who didn't yet know what trust was supposed to look like. After a moment, she reached out and gently touched 3 of the musical notes, then whispered, barely audible, "That's the song Mom used to sing. But I don't remember the words." Michael placed a hand softly on her forehead. He couldn't speak. Inside his chest, emotions surged like water, threatening to burst a dam, but his face stayed calm. On the small table nearby, a tilted photo frame caught his eye. He picked it up. It was his wife Sarah during her final weeks of pregnancy, standing in front of the hospital, her smile serene, her long hair hanging loose. The photo had faded with time, but the light in her eyes still held something no dust or wind could erase. "Papa," Ellie's voice pulled him back from the current of memory. She was still sitting quietly, arms wrapped around the frame. "Grandma said, 'Mom died because of me. Is that true?'" Michael didn't answer right away. He pulled her into his arms. After a long pause, he finally spoke, each word drawn slowly from a well of memory. "You were never the reason. Your mother. She would have been the last person to want you to believe that." Ellie rubbed her eyes and nestled deeper into his chest. Her tiny hands clutched the photo frame tightly, as if letting go would make her mother's memory disappear. Michael looked down at the drawing still in her hands, the shaky letters like broken notes in a half-finished song. Her pain didn't need a name. It was written in every pencil line, in every trembling curve of her letters. He understood then that some wounds couldn't be healed by words, only eased by steady presence, patient listening, and unconditional love. No one teaches you how to be a father when you're starting from fragments, but Michael knew he could begin again, one day at a time, from wherever his little girl's heart still dared to beat with hope. Some children don't need lullabies. They just need someone who truly listens. "Did you ever plan on opening the door for her?" Michael let the question fall like a knife into still water. He didn't expect an answer. He didn't even wait for a nod. His gaze, hardened by years on military fields, now reflected only the disorientation of a father who no longer recognized the home he once believed would keep his daughter safe. Margaret remained seated, arms crossed, her eyes fixed on the faded tablecloth. "What are you trying to say, Michael?" He didn't repeat himself. The question didn't need repeating because Ellie had already answered it with the broken pieces of her dreams. The night before, she had screamed in her sleep, "Grandma, I'll eat. I already ate. Please open the door." Her pleading sounded like it came from the bottom of a well, slicing through Michael's chest one beat at a time. Every time Ellie cried like that, he was a child again, standing in the same kitchen facing a mother whose hands were as hard as sun-baked earth. "She needs to sleep in a room with light and someone beside her. So now you're going to tell me how to raise my grandchild?" Michael looked her directly in the eyes. He didn't lower his head like he used to. "I'm just saying what needs to be said." Margaret's mouth curled into a smirk. Her voice dropped into a low, cold timbre, like it was dragging up an old debt. Do you remember who carried you to the clinic every time you had a fever? Did I ever lock you up? I worked 12 hours a day, came home cooked, your porridge bathed, you washed your clothes. You think raising a child means sitting around singing lullabies. Raising a child means giving up a part of yourself every single day and hoping they don't grow up blaming you for it. Her tone wasn't loud, but it was even and icy, as if the past had disguised itself as logic justifying the wounds she had etched into her granddaughter. Michael stood still. He didn't lower his head. His voice didn't shake. He simply stepped back half a pace, his eyes steady, and spoke quietly as if drawing the words from the bottom of a deep well of disappointment. I don't need you to apologize, but I can't let this go on any longer. Ellie was huddled in the corner of the bed, her eyes locked onto her father's hand, like it was the last thread tying her to a sense of safety. She was still too young to understand it all, but her memory had already stored nameless silences. She remembered the sighs after every scolding, the dull yellow glow of the garage light blinking out as if it would never return, and the cold bowl of rice, hard as stone, that she tried to finish quickly just to please her grandmother. That night, Michael sat quietly at the edge of the bed, eyes fixed on the rise and fall of his daughter's chest. The room around them was nearly still. The only sound was Ellie's uneven breathing, a soft reminder of the things he hadn't been able to protect. The old thin blanket, its edges worn and frayed, was the only relic left from her mother, and now served as the fragile wall she used to defend herself from invisible fears. He leaned toward the nightstand where a colored piece of paper was taped with old yellowing strips. Ellie had drawn a small house under a heavy gray cloud with a single door front and center, marked by an oversized lock. Across the roof, she had scrawled the words, "Do not open," in uneven letters. It wasn't just a warning. It was a mark of what she had lived through. The glass of cold milk trembled slightly in Michael's hand as he left the room. His steps were slow, careful not to wake her. Ellie was still curled up under the blanket, her breath steady, but her lashes stiff as if they had only just dried from crying. Michael crossed the yard, his heart weighed down, and stopped in front of the weathered wooden door of the neighboring house. He knocked gently. Each knock sounded like it echoed through his own worries. Rachel opened the door, her hands still dusted with cornmeal. "Michael?" He nodded. "Sorry to bother you, but I need to ask you something. About my mother." Rachel's face went still. She wiped her hands on her apron, opened the door wider, and gestured for him to come in. She pulled out a wooden chair gently and placed both hands on the table as if anchoring herself to things left unsaid. The faint warmth of cornbread mixed with the aroma of black coffee lingered in the air, but her eyes didn't rest on either. They stayed on Michael's face, searching. I heard it, more than once. The crying, the footsteps pounding on the door. At first I thought it was mice, but one morning I was out watering the flowers just before sunrise, and I heard the little girl calling, softly like she was afraid to be heard. Michael said nothing. He just sat there, hands resting on his knees, his nails pressing lightly into each other. I thought maybe she was sleepwalking. Then I got scared. I didn't know what to do. Your mother, she's not the kind of person you can easily talk to. Were you afraid of my mom? No. Rachel let out a long breath, but I was afraid of the way everyone around here stayed quiet. Everyone saw something, but they all turned away. From the old radio near the window, a low bolero played softly, weaving through the ordinary sounds of a quiet morning. Michael wasn't paying attention to the music, but the lyrics fell at just the right moment. The silent ones are speaking in their own way. On his way home, Michael stopped by the corner store and bought his daughter a new crayon. He didn't say why, but something in him had already decided. Maybe not today, but very soon he would open that door again. Not to look back, but to make sure it never closed again. Michael pushed the door open. His eyes went straight to the corner of the room. Ellie was sitting on the tile floor, carefully scrubbing dried purple ink with a wrinkled old rag. He didn't scold her. He didn't ask anything. He just knelt down and gently placed the new crayon into her small palm, like a quiet promise that from now on there would be light instead of darkness. "What are you drawing?" "I'm drawing a door that's open." Then draw some light around it." Ellie looked up. "Like the first time you opened the door?" Michael didn't answer right away, but he reached out and brushed her tangled hair with his fingers and said in a voice just low enough for her to hear, "Not everyone who opens a door is brave, but the ones who keep it open and filled with light, those are the people you can trust." Some mornings didn't begin with an alarm clock. They came with the sound of someone's footsteps on the roof, a softly shut door, or the chill sneaking through the cracks of old walls. Michael often woke up on mornings like that. No one needed to call him, and he didn't need a reason to rise. He was used to opening his eyes into silence, where the only sound was the rhythm beating quietly in his chest. The wooden table by the window was still there, worn down in the spots where hands had rested over the years. That morning, Michael didn't drink coffee. He didn't even reach for the wristwatch that had stopped ticking 3 weeks ago. The only thing he did was sit there, hands clasped together, eyes fixed on the small window in front of him. Through the blurry glass, he could still see the backyard damp with morning dew, where small white stones lining the path were still glistening with moisture. Behind him, Ellie was still asleep. She was probably lying on her side, one arm wrapped around the stuffed bear with the missing ear. Michael knew she didn't scream in her sleep anymore, but she still hadn't slept through a full night. A child's mind always found a way to store the scratches, especially the ones no one else could see. The faint sound of footsteps floated in like a breeze weaving through leaves. Michael turned around. Ellie was coming toward him, holding her bear close one ear, dangling her messy hair covering half her face. She climbed into the wooden chair like she had done it 100 times before, but this time she moved slower, more hesitant. She sat in silence for a moment, eyes avoiding her dad's, tilting her head slightly toward the chair as she asked in a whisper, as if telling a secret to the floor, "Daddy, do you know what a dream without sound feels like?" Michael tilted his head. "What did you dream about?" Ellie didn't look up. She placed the bear on the table, slowly smoothing its torn ear with her finger, then replied, "I was lying on the ground. Everything around me was black like ink. I kept singing, but no one heard me. No one opened the door. I thought maybe my voice was too small. Even Mom didn't open it." That last sentence made Michael lower his head. He reached out, gently touching her small hand like he was afraid something fragile might break. The light from the window was just enough to show him that her eyes were still fixed on the bear. In that moment, he wasn't sure what broke his heart more, that Ellie felt invisible or that she believed she was the reason everyone disappeared. After a short breakfast, which Ellie barely touched before pushing her plate away, Michael went into the bedroom to look for an old tin box wrapped in coarse fabric. He opened it, his chest tightening slightly at the sight of the silver voice recorder inside, the only thing his wife had left behind that wasn't written in ink. A few faded scratches on its metal surface whispered that time spared no memory, no matter how sacred. He pressed play. The tape whirred for a moment, then went still. A voice began to sing, a little shaky but warm, "Duermete mi amor, que la noche no duele si hay luz en tu corazón." Michael didn't finish listening to the recording. He turned off the device midway and closed his eyes as if the voice had stirred something too deep to hold. Then he got up, walked into the living room, and placed the recorder into Ellie's hands, where she sat with her feet swinging just above the floor. She hugged the small machine tightly to her ear, as if letting go would make the voice disappear forever. Her wide eyes opened even wider, lashes trembling. After a long pause, she whispered, "Mom sang prettier than Grandma. Mom never yelled at me when I sang." Michael didn't respond. He sat beside her and gently wrapped an arm around her shoulders. In that quiet moment, he realized Ellie didn't need a perfect lullaby. She only needed someone willing to truly listen to her smallest whispers, even when they didn't make a sound. When night fell, Michael tucked the recorder into his shirt pocket and pretended to head out for bread, just like he always did. But this time he circled around the back of the house and stood quietly outside the kitchen window. A soft light glowed across the counter, just enough to cast pale reflections on the wall. Inside, Margaret was slicing carrots and talking on the phone. Her hands moved quickly, but her voice was dry, sharp. She started that singing thing again, like she wants the whole world to pity her. "I've had enough. She's the daughter of that woman who was always playing the victim. You think I'm going to sit here and cry with her? No way. I'm not soft like that. Her mom died and left me with this burden. Who's supposed to love that Michael didn't go in? He turned around and walked back into the yard, his feet barely touching the ground. His back was stiff, his breath caught in his throat. He went straight into the room, sat down on the wooden floor and leaned against the wall. His hands trembled slightly as he turned the recorder back on. Margaret's voice still echoed each word, cutting like a dull knife across nerves already worn thin by rage. He pulled out his notebook, tore off a corner, and scribbled a line in uneven strokes. I thought my mother could be you. I was wrong. Soft footsteps tapped down the hallway like the final sound of a long day. Ellie stood in the doorway, clutching the recorder like it held a secret she wasn't ready to speak. No one said a word. Michael looked up and met her gaze, then silently opened his arms. She stepped forward, climbed into his lap, and rested her head against his chest, like she had finally returned to where she belonged. No explanations, no questions. Just 2 heartbeats, slow and steady, writing a new lullaby in silence. Outside, the wind moved through the trees, rustling past the cracks in the old windows. Inside the house held its breath wrapped in stillness, except for the sound of 2 hearts and a tape that hadn't finished playing. The old may forget the things they said on a phone call they never meant to remember. But children don't forget. The sounds adults assume will be lost. And the wind often stay echoing in a child's heart for years. And sometimes forgiveness doesn't mean pretending we didn't hear. It means asking whether the person who hurt us still deserves a place inside our arms. That night, Michael didn't sleep. He rested his hand on Ellie's chest, counting each breath as if trying to preserve the fragile life he almost lost while fighting a war far from home. He didn't think of combat. He didn't think of the damage already done. He thought of only one thing: how to make sure that from now on, Ellie's dreams would never again be shaped by voiceless darkness. Behind the old house next to the dry well, a rust-colored iron bucket lay tipped over beside a patch of moss-covered stone. Michael stood beside it for a long moment without drawing any water. With one finger, he slowly spun the metal handle as if his mind were drifting toward things no longer present. One sentence kept echoing in his head, something Ellie had whispered in the middle of the night, sweat soaking through the collar of his shirt. "Dad, I was inside a dark box. I kept singing, but no one opened the door." Ellie hadn't said it in a frightened voice. She spoke like she was describing an old game, boring and repetitive, but one she still had to play every day. That calmness was what sent chills down Michael's spine. A child who knows fear might eventually learn how to overcome it, but a child who grows used to darkness doesn't have to overcome fear anymore. They have to overcome acceptance. Michael rescheduled Ellie's routine health check earlier than planned. He didn't offer much explanation to the doctor, just one sentence. "I'd like a more thorough evaluation of her mental and emotional state." The medical center in Kerrville wasn't large, but the children's behavioral health unit was bright and clean, with sunlight pouring through the wide windows. Ellie sat on a red plastic chair, nervously twisting the hem of her dress in her hands, her eyes fixed on a small cactus pot on the doctor's desk. Michael sat beside her. He didn't take his eyes off her for even a moment. The first evaluator was Dr. Emily Harrison, a woman in her 50s with silver-rimmed glasses and a low, quiet voice. She asked Ellie a few simple questions: her name, her age, her favorite animal, the last song she remembered hearing. Ellie didn't answer all of them. Some, she shook her head; at others, she only responded with a shrug. Michael didn't step in. He didn't rush her. He sat quietly back straight, his hand resting lightly on her knee, a silent gesture of protection. Dr. Harrison gave a small nod, then motioned for the next specialist to enter. A woman in her early 40s stepped in. Her black hair was pulled into a neat bun, and her skin carried the warm tone of someone used to the high desert sun. Her name was Jennifer Blake, a therapist specializing in language and behavioral response. She didn't waste time on introductions. Instead, she calmly approached Ellie, slipped off her shoes, and sat cross-legged on the carpet. Her eyes stayed level with Ellie's. Her hands rested gently on her own knees. She didn't try to win Ellie over. She simply sat there like an old friend who had stopped by to visit. "Would you like to draw something?" she asked softly. "Anything that helps you breathe a little easier, even if it's just a squiggle." Ellie lifted her head. After a moment, she gave a small nod. Jennifer opened a box of crayons and, without thinking too much, pulled out 3 brown, black, and blue. She placed a blank sheet of paper on the table in front of Ellie. Ellie lowered her head again, picked up the black crayon, and pressed it gently against the corner of the page. Her strokes were slow, deliberate, as though each line had to pass through something heavy before reaching the paper. A square began to form, dark, thickly outlined. No windows, no light, just the claustrophobic sense of a locked space. In the center, she drew a tiny figure with wide, round eyes and an open mouth, as if it were calling out, but no one could hear. Beside it sat a small, warped bowl. Michael stared at the page, his chest tightening. Jennifer didn't ask anything at first. She simply watched. But when Ellie picked up the black crayon and drew a large shadow in the upper corner of the square, Jennifer gently asked, "Who's this, sweetie?" Ellie answered in a voice so quiet it was almost inaudible. "Grandma." Grandma was standing there. Jennifer nodded, said nothing, and didn't take any notes. She handed Ellie another sheet of paper. Ellie kept drawing. The second room she drew was also closed in, but this time it had a window. Inside was a woman with long hair, a smiling mouth, and open arms. Beside the drawing were the words, "Mom didn't lock the door." Michael bit down hard on his lip. He didn't look at Jennifer, nor at his daughter. In his mind, the voice of Sarah, his late wife, echoed back to him the night before she was admitted to the hospital to give birth. "If our child is born, no matter what happens, promise me. This let them grow up with trust. Don't let them be afraid of the world, especially not from inside their own home." On the drive home, Ellie fell asleep in the back seat, tightly holding her stack of drawings and her box of crayons. Michael didn't drive straight back. Instead, he turned off onto a dirt road that led to the old cemetery where Sarah was buried. Beside the weather-worn headstone, he opened the trunk and pulled out a small tin box labeled Sarah, Memories. Inside was a worn-out voice recorder. Michael plugged in the headphones and pressed play. The tape hissed as it spun slow and scratchy in places. Then, through the soft static, Sarah's voice began to play. "If one day you can no longer hear Mommy singing, you still have the whole sky to whisper back to you. Just don't go silent. Don't learn to endure everything." Michael didn't cry, but his grip on the recorder tightened, as if letting go would cause everything inside him to collapse. Back at the house, while Ellie continued to sleep, he started cleaning out the bookshelf on his own. In the bottom drawer were several old notebooks filled with her scribbles. One caught his eye. The cover was purple. On the first page, in uneven handwriting, was a single sentence, "Grandma said, I made Mommy die." Michael sank down onto the wooden floor. His hands trembled, not with anger, but with helplessness. Children don't make up things like that. They hear them. And once they do, they carry those words forever. That night, Michael sat by his daughter's bed. Ellie was asleep, but her forehead was furrowed and her small arms were curled tightly around herself. Michael took out his own journal and began to write, "I've heard bullets fire right beside my ear. I've held a dying comrade in the trenches, but nothing has ever hit me like hearing my daughter say, 'I miss Mommy. Mommy didn't lock me in,' as if she had to defend herself against her own fear." He paused, then looked over at her. Ellie murmured in her sleep. Mom sang. I can't remember the words. Michael reached over and gently stroked her hair. He leaned closer and whispered, "You don't have to remember all the words. Just remember that Mommy was never someone who made you afraid. And you were never the reason she didn't come back." Outside the window, the wind had started to rise. Tree branches swayed, casting flickering shadows on the walls. In the quiet, worn-down room, no one was singing, no one was laughing. But in the stillness, the sound of an old lullaby still echoed faintly from the recorder. Not for anyone else, just so one little girl would always know she was worth loving. The droplets on the side of the old ceramic jug had long since dried, but Michael still reached out to wipe them as if they had just formed. His eyes were fixed on the empty space ahead, where light from the window streamed through a torn curtain, casting pale lines across the tiled floor. In the small kitchen, the sound of a spoon tapping against a ceramic cup echoed slowly, falling straight into the silence of a gray afternoon. Ellie had just finished her milk with a trace of cream still clinging to the corner of her mouth. She sat on the floor playing with a cloth doll that had lost an arm. Her thin legs stretched out beneath the table, her tangled hair fell over her eyes, and her expression was far too pensive for a 4-year-old child. Michael stepped closer, bent down to gently stroke her hair, then poured more water into her small glass. The atmosphere, which seemed peaceful on the surface, was really just a thin veil stretched over an underlying persistent weariness. Footsteps echoed from the hallway. No one spoke, but the air shifted immediately. Ellie clutched the doll tightly and pressed her face into her father's chest. Michael picked her up and placed her gently on a chair, then quietly went to rinse the cup. Just then, a cold voice floated out from the bedroom through the partially open door. "She's rambling on again about nonsense, all night crying out for her mother like I don't exist. I've already taught her to stay quiet. Don't worry." Michael froze. His hand still gripped the cup. He didn't move, just tilted his head slightly to hear more clearly. The voice didn't carry anger. It was colder than that, casually cruel. "Lilia, I'm serious. What kind of little kid already knows how to fake tears, how to make people feel sorry for her, just like her mother, always misty-eyed, couldn't take a single word of discipline? I'm not letting this one turn into her shadow." The voice ended in a sigh, followed by the dull tapping of fingernails on the wooden table. Michael stepped out of the kitchen, walked down the hallway, and stopped by the bedroom door. He didn't knock, didn't speak. He stood there waiting until the phone call ended. When he entered, Margaret was still sitting in the chair, phone in hand, showing no sign of surprise or embarrassment. "What did you just say, Mom?" Michael's voice was calm, but his eyes couldn't hide the strain behind them. Margaret set the phone down, slowly dabbed her face with a handkerchief, and said, "I was talking to Lilia. She raised 3 grandkids, and every one of them turned out obedient. I just asked her for some advice on how to raise children. What's your problem? Don't I have the right to discipline my own granddaughter?" Michael didn't answer. He walked straight back to the kitchen, turned on the faucet, and continued washing the small cup Ellie had used. Soap suds bubbled up, swirling away down the drain. Every circle his hand made on the rim of the cup mirrored the silent years he had endured. "Do you remember," he said, "when I was 8, you locked me outside the shed for 2 hours because I spilled a bowl of rice?" There was no response, just the faint sound of a chair being adjusted. I cried. Not because I was hungry, but because of the dark. You didn't open the door. No one heard me. I thought I was going to die in there. You're still alive, aren't you? So what's the big deal? Michael turned back, his expression strangely calm. He dried his hands with an old cloth towel, then walked toward the kitchen table where his mother was slowly sipping a cup of cold tea. I'm alive, yes, but I remember exactly what it felt like to be locked out. Every time Ellie panics in the middle of the night, crying from nightmares about the dark, I see myself back then. Do you think that was discipline or just misplaced anger? Margaret didn't respond. Her eyes wandered to the yard where the orange tree stood bare from the cold. Her voice came slowly, without anger, only the weight of memory. You think I didn't love you. You think I hated you. I raised you alone. No one helped me. Then your wife died and left a little girl behind, and I had to do it all over again. Do you have any idea what that feels like? Michael nodded. He poured more water into the kettle, refilled her cup, and gently slid it toward her. I know it wasn't easy. But no one has the right to hurt a child just because they never dealt with their own pain. Do you know why Ellie sings in the dark? Not because she's happy, because she thinks singing might make someone open the door. Margaret's hand paused in midair. The cup wobbled slightly. Michael reached into his shirt pocket and took out a small voice recorder. He set it down on the table without pressing play. His gaze softened. I haven't listened to that recording yet, but I will, and I'll give it to someone who needs to hear it. A long silence passed, like a cold wind moving across the stone patio. Ellie stood in the doorway holding her ragged doll, watching the two adults with a look of quiet confusion, but an instinctive sense of tension. Michael turned to his daughter. "Sweetheart, go play outside with the white cat for a little while. Daddy just needs to finish cleaning up, okay?" She nodded and skipped down the steps. Her small figure disappeared behind the patch of purple daisies in the front yard. "So you're planning to send me to jail?" Margaret's voice for the first time sounded subdued, almost lost. "I just want you to take a real look at what happened. If you honestly believe there was nothing wrong, then there's nothing to be afraid of." Michael stood up, wiped the recorder clean with the cloth, and slipped it back into his inner pocket. Before leaving the kitchen, he paused beside her. "I'm not asking for an apology, but if you've never considered what Ellie went through, then you've turned this house into the same old storage room you once locked me in. Except this time you shut in a child even younger than I was." He walked out of the kitchen. The door clicked shut behind him. Outside, Ellie's quiet laughter floated through the wind. Inside the kitchen, Margaret sat alone. Her tea remained unfinished. She reached for a handkerchief, not to wipe away sweat this time, but to dab a single tear that had slipped down the corner of her eye. One tear. Quietly shed. Some mistakes are not beyond repair, but the first step toward healing is to acknowledge them. Like a rare beam of sunlight breaking through the leaves on a gray afternoon, not bright enough to warm, but enough to remind us that even a neglected garden can bloom again if someone is willing to tend it. The small aluminum spoon rested precariously on the rim of the bowl of cold porridge. A thin, cloudy film covered the surface like a forgotten layer of time. Ellie didn't touch it. She didn't even look at it. Her eyes were fixed on the crack in the wall where a tangled wire ran like veins under torn skin. Michael didn't push her. He sat across from her, one hand resting on the table, his fingers tapping lightly on the wood, each slow beat like the tick of an old clock marking the silence of a late afternoon. Outside, the wind carried the smell of damp ash from a pile of half-burned firewood, lingering like memories not yet laid to rest. After a long while, Ellie finally spoke. "Grandma said if I don't keep my mouth shut, Mommy will cry in heaven." Michael looked up slowly, turning his gaze toward his daughter. He didn't ask her to repeat it. That single sentence, light as a whisper, was enough to unravel all the calm he had tried to build up over the past few days. "Do you think your mom is really sad?" he asked, his voice just soft enough not to startle her. Ellie shook her head, her eyes still glued to the crack in the wall. "I don't know her face. I only know her from the song." Michael swallowed hard. He reached across the table and gently touched her small hand. In the dim light swaying from the old yellow bulb, two hands, one rough, one tiny, rested together without needing another word. Ellie whispered as if only the wind should hear it. "Grandma said Mommy left me because I cried too much." That night, Michael closed the tape recorder and placed it in the drawer. He had listened to the recordings of his mother's phone conversations, those harsh, cutting remarks spoken on cold nights while he pretended not to be home, pretending just so she would reveal her truest self when no one was watching. Once Ellie was asleep, he put on his old jacket, tucked a few documents into his pocket, and walked past two houses to the apartment at the end of the alley. A soft yellow light glowed from Helen Carter's kitchen window. The faint scent of cinnamon drifted on the breeze. The door opened after just two gentle knocks. The silver-haired woman, her hair tied up with a cloth ribbon, looked at him. She didn't smile, didn't ask questions. She simply stepped aside. "What did you see?" Michael sat down on the wooden chair, his voice low. Helen set a warm cup of water on the table. Her eyes didn't meet his. They stayed fixed on the wall where a small framed image of Our Lady of Guadalupe hung. After a long pause, she began to speak slowly. "There was one time I saw the little girl standing out in the yard in the middle of the day. The sun was blazing. Her head was down. She was holding a rock in her hands." Michael didn't interrupt. Margaret was sitting on the porch fanning herself. She was saying something, but I couldn't hear it. I only saw that when the child reached for the door, she shoved her down onto the concrete. She poured more water into the glass, then continued. "There was another time. The little girl was singing while playing with a piece of wood, and she yanked her hair and stuffed a white rag in her mouth. I saw it because I happened to be washing my hands out back. Her voice trembled. I know I was wrong not to step in, but I had no proof. She's your mother. Who would have believed me? Michael stayed silent. Outside, the wind hissed through the cracks in the old wall like the breath of someone too afraid to speak. The girl once looked at me through the window bars, her eyes like someone had taught her never to expect anything from adults. That night, Michael didn't go home right away. He sat for a long time on the front steps of Helen Carter's house, the dry, cold wind brushing across his aching wrists. When he returned home, Ellie was already asleep. She lay with her head resting on a pillow, embroidered with purple flowers, the blanket pulled up to her chin. The nightlight, shaped like a star, cast a soft, steady glow, making everything in the room seem to breathe at a slower rhythm. Michael sat down at the table, pulled out a stack of paper and a fountain pen. He began to write in a slanted but steady hand, Mr. Eric Dawson. My name is Michael Reese, a veteran. I previously served at the Dry Creek Base. I need to report an incident that took place within my own family involving the abuse of a minor. The evidence has been recorded through audio devices, witness testimony, and the psychological condition of the victim. My daughter, Ellie Reese, age 4. My biological child. He paused, took a long breath, then continued. When a child fears the person who gave them life, a father can't stay silent. Not because I'm her biological father, but because I'm the only one left who's clear-headed enough to act, while the rest of my family has chosen to turn away. The next day, he printed the letter, folded it neatly, and placed it in an envelope, along with 2 drawings Ellie had made, one of a dark garage and one of a man in a military cap opening a door with light pouring through. When Ellie woke up, she didn't ask about her grandmother. She didn't bring up the story from the day before. She just asked, Papa, do purple flowers bloom in the cold? Michael smiled and brushed her hair gently. They bloom slower, but they still bloom. Because they don't need sunlight. They just need someone who won't pull them out. There are wounds that don't bleed but still need healing. Not because they're too big, but because people keep pretending they don't see them. The scent of cinnamon from a tea bag still lingered in the damp air of the kitchen. Michael set the cup down on the tiled counter, but didn't drink. The warm yellow light shone down on his hand, his thumb lightly pressing the record button even though the conversation in the living room had ended long ago. He didn't know how many times he had listened to that recording. Maybe 10, maybe more. Every time his chest tightened, as if the words had just been spoken right here, right now in this very house, by the woman he had once believed to be his mother. That little girl is just like her mother, always with those wet eyes, always daydreaming. I can't stand kids like that. Locking her up is the only way to get her to stop that stupid singing. Michael stopped his hand. He didn't rewind. The sound cut off like a curse pulled back from the base of the speaker's throat. He placed the recorder down, wrapped it in his late wife's old handkerchief, and tucked it into his shirt pocket. Tiny footsteps echoed softly from the hallway. Ellie walked in, hugging her stuffed bunny hair, tousled traces of sleep tears still on her face. She didn't say a word. She climbed onto the chair and curled up in her father's lap like she had done so many times before. Michael wrapped his arms around her. His cheek rested lightly on the top of her head, as if her scent was the only thing keeping him grounded in that moment. You didn't have any dreams tonight, did you? He asked gently, not really expecting an answer. Ellie shook her head, but after a moment she whispered, In the dream, someone pointed a flashlight at me. But then you came. Michael stiffened. His arms instinctively tightened around her. If a 4-year-old had to use the word dream to describe what safety felt like, then maybe her waking life was the nightmare. He gently carried her back to bed and waited until her breathing grew steady again. Before leaving, he tucked the thin blanket back around her feet where she often kicked it off when dreaming of being locked in. The storage room still held the old smells of paint and cold earth. But tonight, Michael felt like it wasn't silent anymore. Even with no one inside, no footsteps, no crying, something lingered in the air. A breath caught between the walls, or maybe a song that never found a voice. He didn't turn on the light. His hand moved slowly through the dark, tracing the edge of the old table to the wooden shelf. Beneath a paint bucket, he found a small shoebox covered in dust. He gently pulled it out, set it on the floor, and opened the lid. Inside were folded pieces of paper, some yellowed with time, others smudged as if water had run across them. All were drawings, childlike, messy but unmistakable. A dark room, a locked door, a cold bowl of food, a little girl kneeling and holding a stuffed bunny. Then there was another drawing. Sunlight streaming through a narrow crack, a man standing outside with his hand on the door. At the bottom of the paper, written in smeared ink, were the words, "I wish Papa would open the door for me." He sat down on the tiled floor, holding the piece of paper in his hands, eyes wide and lost like someone who had just stepped out of his own life. There was no thunder, no dramatic music, only the sound of his own heart pounding in his chest. Some dreams, when written down by a child, demand a response from the adult world. It was 10 o'clock at night. The light in Helen Carter's house was still on. She opened the door before she even finished tying her scarf. Whatever surprise had been on her face disappeared the moment she saw Michael standing there, holding a box of drawings and a small plastic bag filled with medical records. "I have the evidence now," Michael said. His eyes weren't red, but his voice sounded worn thin. "And I don't think I can keep her there even one more night." Helen didn't ask questions. She simply nodded and stepped aside to let him in. A tray of tea was already set on the table, as if she had been waiting for Michael to arrive at exactly this moment. He placed everything down, pulled a small recorder from his pocket. "There's one part that's clear enough." Helen didn't move closer, didn't interrupt. She simply listened as Margaret Reese's voice echoed from the recorder, sharp, bitter, and loud, as if she were standing right there in the room. "Some people give birth and never learn how to be a mother," Helen said quietly, her hand resting on her cup. "And some people like you don't need to learn. They just know." Michael nodded slightly. He didn't say thank you. That word was for people who helped you avoid falling into a pit. Right now, he was already in the pit. She was just the one person who hadn't walked away from the edge. Just before midnight, the headlights of a police car lit up the cobblestone street. Ellie was asleep in Helen's spare room. Michael stood outside in the yard holding the recorder tightly in his hand. 2 officers stepped out. One of them was someone he recognized, Lieutenant Eric Dawson, his former commanding officer from the border unit. There were no sirens, no shouting, just Eric's low, steady voice. "Can I take a look at the file and the recorder?" Michael nodded. His hand trembled slightly as he handed them over, not from fear, but from having carried it all alone for far too long. After reviewing the contents, Eric gave a small nod. "We'll ask her to come in for a behavioral assessment. Everything will go through proper channels. Is it all right if the girl stays here with Mrs. Carter for now?" Michael turned to look at the window where the light from his daughter's room still glowed softly. Then he said, "Thank you, but she's been waiting long enough for me to open that door." Some doors aren't locked with keys. They're sealed by silence, by lies, and by habits passed down by people too proud to admit they were wrong. But there are also people like Michael, quiet enough to listen and brave enough to speak up. Because in this world, the cruelest thing isn't a slap or a scream. It's letting a child believe that no one needs to hear them cry. An adult can forget many things: the name of an old friend, the scent of their childhood home, even the moments when they were wrong. But there is one thing a child never forgets: the first time they were made to believe they were not loved. And even if that wound is eventually healed, it leaves a quiet scar stitched into memory. The wooden chair creaked softly in the nameless waiting room. Michael Reese sat upright, loosely holding a cup of cold coffee, his eyes fixed on the frosted glass window at the end of the hallway, the one that marked the witness entrance. The room wasn't warm enough to push back the chill slowly crawling up his spine, not because of the weather, but because of his daughter's silence since yesterday. Ellie didn't cry anymore. She didn't laugh, didn't protest when he asked her to eat. She just drew. One blank page after another turned slowly, the crayons wearing down each sketch, silent, like her voice had poured itself onto paper instead. Michael didn't stop her, didn't urge her. He simply watched and wrote what needed to be written in the same notebook he had always kept hidden under his mattress during deployment. Now it had become his journal. The steel door cracked open. Dr. Lauren Pierce, the psychologist, walked in and motioned for him to follow. She had once worked for the public health unit. In Ridgefield, had handled many cases involving children far more severe than this, but today her head bowed lower than usual. She hasn't said a single word, Michael. But when I showed her a flashcard with the word mother, she immediately turned away. When I said grandmother, she covered her ears. She didn't scream, but her heart rate spiked unnaturally. Michael nodded slowly. I understand. Dr. Pierce opened her notebook, flipped to the last line, and looked up. My professional assessment is this Ellie is exhibiting behavioral symptoms consistent with prolonged confinement and isolation. She's been forced into silence in a restricted space and subjected to repeated negative commands. The phrase, "I hate you," triggers a measurable physiological reaction, trembling hands and muscle tension across the face. He didn't say anything more. He just placed his fingertip on the rim of the coffee cup and slowly traced it. The county courtroom wasn't large, and it certainly wasn't grand. The wooden benches were chipped, the yellow walls stained with time, and the ceiling fan turned slowly, like the shallow breath of a small town. But today, within those walls, there was a silence heavier than any trial that had come before. Margaret Maggie Reese sat upright. Her eyes didn't avoid anyone. In fact, they scanned the room as if searching for someone to blame for this accusation. She wore a dark brown cardigan, the same one Michael had seen her wear to acquaintances' funerals. This time, it was another kind of funeral. Not for someone who had died, but for the things she had long believed were right. The presiding judge was a woman named Natalie Whitman, petite in stature, with thin-rimmed glasses and eyes that could cut through layers of pretense. Michael Reese, please step forward. He approached the witness stand with nothing but a small notebook and a USB flash drive. Can you summarize the events from your perspective? Michael opened the notebook but didn't read from it. He looked directly at the judge and spoke each word clear and deliberate. My daughter doesn't know how to lie. She doesn't even know how to write in capital letters yet. But she knows fear, and she only fears one person. The benches behind him fell completely silent. Michael inserted the USB into the courtroom display system. The audio played. The voice was sharp, unmistakable. She cries because she wants attention. I told her to shut her mouth, and she still whines like a stray cat. Her mother was the same, always singing some pitiful song. That sad excuse for music stinks up the house. The voice was Margaret Reese's. She sat upright, a faint smile on her face. The defense attorney blinked rapidly but didn't object. He knew that at this point any objection would be pointless. The recording ended. No yelling, no loud noises, just a very short segment. But it was enough. Ellie can't testify, Michael continued, but she can draw. He turned toward his daughter, who sat at the back of the courtroom beside Helen Carter. The little girl looked at him, then quietly pulled a folded sheet of paper from her pocket and handed it to Helen. The woman stood, walked forward, and placed the drawing on the judge's desk. Everyone in the room leaned in to look. A dark garage, the door slightly ajar. A soldier stood outside the sun, rising over his shoulder. Next to him, a tiny girl held onto a red string that trailed behind her, leading to a long shadow on the floor. Judge Natalie Whitman gave a small nod. That drawing says more than a sworn statement. The defense attorney rose and offered several mitigating circumstances: advanced age, underlying health conditions, memory lapses. Judge Whitman didn't react. When she asked, "Does the defendant have any final words before the court recesses to deliberate?" Margaret Reese looked straight at Michael. She didn't turn to face the judge. Her voice wasn't shaking, wasn't soft, not even cold anymore. It was hollow. "You're just going to make her weak like you." Michael didn't reply. He just blinked, then turned away. The verdict came in less than an hour. 10 years of prison time interspersed with mandatory psychiatric treatment at a facility in Pine Hollow. A permanent restraining order prohibiting all contact with minors. Margaret didn't react. She stood, walked to the officer waiting with handcuffs, and held out her wrists like it was the most natural thing she had ever done. At the door, she suddenly turned around. But she didn't look at her son. Her eyes locked on Ellie. The little girl buried her face in Helen Carter's shoulder, not out of fear, but because there was nothing left to look back at. That afternoon, after leaving the courthouse, Michael and Ellie sat in the car for a long time before he turned the key. She was still holding a crayon, sketching a new sun at the edge of her paper. Michael spoke without looking at her. No child should ever have to hear the words, "I hate you," no matter who they come from. Ellie didn't answer. She just set the crayon down, turned to her father, and for the first time in days whispered, "Daddy." "Can we plant flowers in front of the garage?" Michael gave her a slow smile. He nodded, because somewhere the sun was starting to rise again behind the soldier's shoulder, and even the doors that once held darkness could become places where flowers bloom if someone is willing to open them. There are some things time cannot heal, only the present can soothe them. Especially for a child, every peaceful sleep is a victory. Ellie woke up on her own. She sat up, her eyes still misty with early morning haze, her lips slightly pressed together as if trying to hold on to a dream not yet finished. Michael stood by the door holding a warm cotton towel. He didn't say anything. He simply placed the towel on the chair and let her come to him if she wanted. Morning in the countryside near Pine Hollow was unlike anywhere else. The air carried the scent of damp earth mixed with a faint hint of lemon from the backyard garden. Familiar sounds filled the space gently, a rooster's crow, the drip of water from a leaky faucet, the clink of a spoon against a ceramic mug, all unfolding as slowly as the breath of someone who had stopped running from the past. Ellie stepped barefoot onto the porch. In front of her was the patch of earth she and her father had planted flowers in just a week ago. The first purple blossoms had begun to bloom, still small and leaning slightly to one side. She bent down, gently touched a petal, then whispered something only she could hear. Michael stood behind her in silence, watching. He didn't intrude on the moment. Some things between a child and life are best left untouched, because even love can become a kind of damage when it interrupts too soon. When Rachel called them in for breakfast, Ellie turned and smiled faintly. It was a kind of smile Michael had never seen on his daughter's face before. Not radiant, not showy, but enough to know that this child was growing up in the gentlest way possible. Breakfast was simple fried eggs, toasted bread, and a few slices of banana. Rachel wasn't the talkative type, but she always remembered that Ellie preferred orange juice over milk. Michael realized that truly kind people never had to prove they were good. They just quietly did the right thing. When Ellie finished eating, she cleared her own plate. Then she walked up to Rachel, gently touched the hem of her shirt, and whispered, "Can I draw my mom today?" Rachel softly brushed the girl's hair and answered, "From memory or from a dream?" Ellie stayed quiet for a moment, then replied, "Both." She ran into her room, grabbed colored paper and a box of crayons. Michael watched her go, feeling something inside him loosen. It wasn't quite relief, but it was something deep enough to let him breathe. He stepped out to the porch, where the old wooden door remained slightly open. In front of him, the row of purple flowers leaned under the morning sun. The breeze blew dust against his pants, but he didn't mind. He bent down, adjusted a few stems, then sat on the ground, arms behind him, head tilted toward the sky. He began softly humming the part of the recording Ellie liked most. "When the stars grow quiet, don't be afraid of the night winds." His wife's lullaby was still stored in that small recorder on Ellie's bedside table. Every night before bed, she asked to hear it. And not once had Michael refused. "I remember what she smelled like. She always wore purple. She never locked me in my room." That's what Ellie once said. Simple, quiet, but like a blade pressed gently against his chest. He didn't know how much longer it would take for her to truly leave the nightmares behind, but at least now she had learned to open the window before falling asleep. At noon, Rachel clipped a few more wildflowers to place in the small vase on the table. She said it didn't have to be pretty, just fresh was enough. Michael sat at the wooden table and opened his notebook. It had grown much thicker than it was in the beginning. On every page was a memory, a whisper, a sentence his daughter had said written in steady handwriting. The door that once locked her in is no longer here, but the light behind that door has followed her to this day. He finished the sentence, set the pen down, and closed the notebook. Sometimes he thought Ellie wouldn't remember everything, but if one day she ever read it again, he hoped she would understand that he never abandoned the small voice she once had in the dark. That afternoon, Ellie ran around the yard holding a fallen flower petal in her hand. She called out to Michael and pointed to an empty patch of soil near the wall. "Can we plant another flower here, Papa?" Michael knelt down and rolled up his sleeves. "Of course, but you have to promise to water it every day." Ellie nodded with conviction. "Because if we don't take care of it, it'll lean to one side again like the ones from before." Michael chuckled, not because it was funny, but because it was true. That night after Ellie had fallen asleep, Michael sat alone in the small kitchen holding a cup of warm tea. Claudia had already gone to bed. The house was quiet with only the steady hum of the ceiling fan spinning above him. No crying, no locked doors, no sharp smell of bleach. Just an ordinary night. Ordinary enough to feel unfamiliar to someone who had grown used to unrest. He reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a drawing Ellie had given him earlier. In it, 3 people stood hand in hand in front of an open door. Purple flowers bloomed at the entrance, and a tiny sun floated above them. At the top of the page, written in a child's unsteady handwriting, were the words, "The house has light now." Michael smiled, then folded the drawing carefully. Even if the past once slammed its doors shut in front of them, the present could still open gently if someone was willing to keep their hand on the doorknob. No one is born to live forever in the dark. Sometimes light doesn't come from a window or a lamp, but from the first person brave enough to step forward and open the door, even with trembling hands. Some doors, even once opened, still leave a cold shadow behind the person who had been locked inside. But the miracle is this: if someone has the courage to come close and take the hand of the one who was hurt, then the light will always find its way back. Michael and Ellie's story isn't just about a father rescuing his daughter from darkness. It's also a reminder justice isn't only about punishment. It's about choosing what's right, even when it means standing up to the very person who gave you life. In this life, maybe we've all seen a child who's too quiet, eyes that seem lost in the middle of laughter. And maybe you've asked yourself, is there a child near me who needs someone to listen? Or maybe you were that child once. If this story moved you or reminded you of someone who's been through the dark, don't hesitate to leave a comment and share. Because sometimes a single story is the bridge someone else needs to cross over their fear. And I would truly love to hear from you. Have you ever met someone like Michael, a father who chose love over silence, or witnessed something so heartless it still haunts you? Friend, I know life can weigh each of us down in different ways. If you're carrying something heavy or just need a space to speak your heart, I'll be here listening through every word you leave behind. Thank you for staying until the end of this video. May you sleep peacefully tonight, and if you dream, may it be a dream filled with the light behind an old door, just like Ellie once dreamed.